Welcome back. I am so excited you came back to join us as we continue on this adventure through Willa of the Wood. I have my copy of my book out and I am thrilled to jump right in, right where we left off last time. Really a huge cliffhanger. We're going to find out how Willa makes out on this next big part of her adventure. So I have picked up my copy and I'm ready to start at chapter 37. I hope you are too. In my copy, it starts on page 186. Willa crept up to the edge of the forest, wove herself into the leaves of the undergrowth, and gazed towards the wooden lair of the dayfolk man who had shot her. The man was walking across the grass, his black and white dog following closely at his side. He wore a brown vest and a shirt with wrinkled sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his eyes from the sun. She didn't know all of the English words the homesteaders used, but she was pretty sure that they called the lairs they lived in a cabin or a house, depending on how they had cut up the bodies they had used to make it. They were crude words, and she didn't like them in her mind, and she knew that the barn was where they kept their animals. Many of the homesteaders lived in small log cabins, but this man had built a house, a barn, and a third building she didn't have a name for. And this was the building he was walking towards. He had covered the roof of the building with overlapping slices of dead trees, and he'd pieced together the walls from stones he'd stolen from the river. But the oddest feature of the building was that it had a large wooden wheel on the side with a thick central shaft, 8 spokes, and what looked like rectangular wooden buckets hanging on the curve of the wheel. She couldn't imagine what it was all for. The man walked over to a narrow channel that he dug in the ground to take water from the river and then pulled on a lever that opened some sort of divider. The stolen water came gushing through a chute and splashed down onto the buckets. There was a deep groaning sound, and then, to her amazement, the wheel began to turn, the buckets filling at the top and then emptying at the bottom, with the water pouring into a small pond and then continuing on through another channel back towards the river. She'd never seen anything like it. The man was stealing the water of the river and then giving it back. The shaft of the center of the wheel turned, and something inside the building rumbled with the grinding, gritty sound of stone rubbing on stone. She couldn't understand how he took the movement of the water and changed it into the movement of the wheel, but that was the spell he had cast. And then a loud clanking noise erupted from the building, and the wheel shook violently, and the wood twisting and creaking as if the wheel was going to tear apart. The man lurched forward and closed the divider as quickly as he could, bringing the wheel to a shuddering halt. He gazed at his contraption in stunned confusion. Then his face clouded with anger and clenched his jaw as if he suspected an enemy had purposefully sabotaged his machine. He grabbed a tool with a long metal handle, then climbed up the giant wheel and clawed through the spokes in a dense thicket of metal branches. He clanged and he twisted. He hammered and he shoved, shouting out harsh words she didn't understand. When he finally crawled out again, his knuckles were bloody. He went over to the lever and pulled it for the second time. The water came tumbling down as it had before, and the wheels started to turn once more. This time he didn't just look satisfied that his machine was working, he looked defiant, as if he had defeated the most powerful of enemies. Over the next hour, he carried large burlap bags into the building on his shoulders. She had seen the farmers in Cade's Cove filling bags like these with wheat from their fields. She stayed where she was in the forest, but she watched him through the open windows and door of the building. The man poured the bags into a metal mouth where the grains trickled down in between 2 flat stones and were ground into a whitish yellow powder. While the water wheel did its work, the man walked over to the stack of severed limbs and trunks at the side of his house, picking up a killing axe and started cleaving the logs in half. The wood was from the previous season, so she didn't hear its cries, but it was still difficult to watch. She hated how he used a wood-handled axe to cut more wood. As he split one log after another, he grunted, slamming the axe into the wood harder and harder with each stroke. The wood made a sharp cracking sound as he split it. Sweat beaded on his brow, and he ground his teeth as he hurled the cloven slabs of wood aside. It seemed as if he had fixed the problem with the wheel, so why was he so angry? Frustration seemed to be boiling up inside him. It was like he didn't want to just split those pieces of trees, but crack open the earth they'd grown from. His breath got louder and louder. His whiskered face contorted with pain. And he just kept splitting one log after another until his hands bled onto the handle of the axe. It reminded her of when she climbed the mountains, the way she hadn't cared that the rocks were cutting her hands. She had wanted the rocks to cut into her hands. Finally exhausted, he hurled the axe to the ground, collapsed beside the pile of wood that he had made, and dropped his head into his cupped hands. He rubbed his face and eyes as if he wanted to smear some memory from his mind. In that moment, she remembered sitting by the stream that had carried her away from the lair, trying to rub the images of her Mama's dead body away. She remembered the longing in her heart and the sadness in her soul. The man's shoulders drooped as he went quiet, and she watched as his anger melted into a slow and dying anguish. He made no noise, but she could see his body shaking as he sobbed. His dog, seeming to sense his master needed his help, lay down beside him. The man slowly stopped sobbing and rubbed the scruff of the dog's neck with his hand as he stared with glazed eyes out into the forest. She didn't understand what was happening to him, why he was acting this way, but she could see that the man did not have his killing stick with him, and his axe was out of reach now, a few feet away. Her heart pounded, and perspiration rose on her arms. She was finding it more and more difficult to breathe, but she slowly stepped out of the forest, and she showed herself to him. The man looked at her in surprise, but did not immediately try to kill her. He did not run for his killing stick when he saw her standing there at the edge of the woods. He did not reach for the axe or pull out the knife he carried at his side. He did not rouse his dog. He did not move in any way. But she knew he saw her. She could see his striking, bright blue eyes staring at her intently, as if he could not quite believe what he was seeing. She stood a dozen steps away from him, but she felt the movement of his chest as he breathed slow, steady breaths. "You're alive?" he said, his voice soft and low, but filled with a trace of amazement. "And you've come back to me?" She did not speak, but she studied him, and she let him study her, and for the moment, for the both of them, that was enough. Her heart beat in her chest as he looked at her. The quills on the back of her neck tingled. "This is my enemy," she thought, "and he's seeing me." The man stood perfectly still, as if he knew that the slightest movement would scare her off. When a breeze swept through the boughs of the tree, she stepped back, blended into the forest, and disappeared. The next day, she watched him from the forest. He moved in and out of the house, sometimes working in his barn, feeding his goats and his chickens, or using tools she did not understand. Other times, he worked in the building that used the water of the river to turn the giant wheel. He worked quietly and on his own, but sometimes he paused in his work and looked out into the forest, scanning the trees with a careful eye. As the sun set and slowly withdrew its light from the trees of the surrounding forest, the man went back into the house. She watched as the window near the eating room lit up with the soft glow of a candle. The stars above the trees provided all the light she needed to see, but she liked watching the glowing radiance of the candle as the man moved from one room to another, the light moving with him, leaving darkness behind, until finally He went up the stairs into the room where she had once seen him laying asleep in his bed, and the candle went out. It was a warm summer evening with yellow-green fireflies lighting on and off in the open area in front of the man's house while he slept. She walked over to a stand of beautiful old sourwood trees growing near the side of house, with their craggy gray bark and their long, wavy limbs. "Hello, my friends," she said to them in the old language, touching their trunks with their open hand as she walked among them. "It's good to meet you all." Deciding not to make a cocoon that night, she picked the tallest of the trees and began to climb its trunk. "I hope you don't mind a friend for the night," she said as she reached its upper branches. Sourwoods weren't large trees, and they had bitter tasting leaves, but she loved their nectar when their flowers blossomed, and she appreciated their peaceful spirits. She always missed them when they slept in the winter and rejoiced when they came awake each spring. She found a good spot in the branches near a tight ball of leaves with a bundle of baby squirrels snoring inside. As the tendrils of the tree gently encircled her body to make sure she didn't fall, she curled up and went to sleep. It was the first night in a long time that she didn't dream of stealing. What an exciting time that Willa has found herself in as she's trying to make her way in the world. Can't wait to see more of her adventure when we continue reading again.